we've called this webinar Death by Webinar. It doesn't mean that it's going to affect your health, certainly not to the extent that you would die from it, but this is about funerals and what people want out of a funeral. And by people, we mean not just the person that died, but also the family and friends of that person. Our CPSA, Combined Pensioners and Superannuants Association, has a long history in advocating on funeral policy, mainly on the pricing of funerals, and in the process really taken it as a given that people basically want the same thing out of a funeral, and that is not necessarily true. So that for that reason, we are doing something different. So I'm introducing now Chris Zinn, who is also on your screen. Chris has a long history in consumer empowerment, as he calls it, which means consumer protection and consumer rights. Chris at the moment is, or has been for a number of years, a board member of Cemeteries and Crematoria New South Wales, which is the regulator, the New South Wales regulator for cemeteries and crematoria. He was formerly nominated by CPSA for that role, and he's been doing that for, I think, is it 4 years, Chris?
That's 5 years.
5 years already. There you go.
And thank you for the nomination and endorsement.
Yeah, sure. So that's Chris is very expert at death, and he will be doing most of the talking. I will be interviewing him and prompting him to say certain things. So, as I said, the idea of this webinar is to get people thinking about how they can have funerals that look like what they want, rather than what a funeral director tells them, and that is an important thing. Chris, respecting the funeral wishes of a person who has died is generally felt to be very important. That sort of drives most of the process, of the decision process about what's going to happen at the funeral. But isn't it also the case that a person who has died's wishes may have been shaped by what they think their family, friends, and associates want? It's sort of an interactive process. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, yeah, and thanks, Paul, and hello to all the listeners and viewers out there. It really is such a fascinating area, this. I've been involved in lots of consumer markets like health insurance and energy, but for me, this area about end of life and how we dispose with dignity of our mortal remains is absolutely a fascinating one. And the point is, what do you do in terms of what is your choice? What is your informed choice? How far can you go and what you want? Now, in some ways, our choices are quite limited. You can essentially be buried or you can be cremated. But the way and the scale you do that, where you choose to be buried or cremated, or where your ashes scattered, who does it? Is it a religious? Is it a civil ceremony? Is there any ceremony at all? You know, is really open to you. So I think it is the one thing that we're very keen at pushing at NSW, and that's the Crematories and Cemetery New South Wales regulator, is for people to think ahead. The worst possible situation, and funeral directors will tell you that this happens not infrequently, is that the family end up bickering about what Auntie Maud wanted at the end. And some will say she swore blind that she wanted to be buried next to, you know, Waverley overlooking the oceans. Others know she wanted to be cremated at Rookwood. So the problem is, where there is a lack of clarity or uncertainty, there can be division and conflict. So making it really clear what you want and where you want and how you want and how it's going to be paid for is really clear. And I don't think you can do that early enough. Now, I have to practice what I preach. I have told people my funeral plans, but I need to kind of write it down in 2 or 3 copies and give it to trusted people so I can make sure it is actually observed.
Yes, it's. I've not made any plans. I not because I fear my funeral, but it seems so far away, and you keep putting it off. But it is absolutely crucial, isn't it, that the person whose funeral it is taking the initiative to get family and friends or anyone that is interested, so to speak, together, so that they understand what that person's wishes are.
I mean, I might just say, in my experience, this does happen. I think most of the time people do that, or at least want to do it. Whether they actually do it in a way that answers all those questions is another issue. But I think we are, you know, more and more people, I like to think, prepared to talk about it. And certainly I'm thinking about family and friends I know that actually they have done this already. Maybe, I don't think I'm listening to me, but they're conscious of the issues that can arise.
Yeah. What age? I mean, I realize there is not one age that you could nominate at which you would start to look at this, but roughly, what sort of situation, what sort of phase of your life should you be to start thinking about what you want for your funeral?
Look, I would say 50, 55. I mean, it's an arbitrary time. You should have another 20 or 30 years left on the perch, as it were. But that's a good time to start thinking about these things. Certainly if you've got a family or a young family. I mean, remember, what's so fascinating about this area, and you alluded to it earlier, I mean, the funeral area is one about the dignified disposal, interment of your remains. It's also about the grief management of those people who are left, your family, what they need, how they'll, you know, the visitation, as they call it. Yeah. And the third section is this area about faith, or indeed lack of faith or belief, and custom and tradition around that. And there's a big whirligig of issues around that, which is quite soluble. You know, you know, humans have been dying since they were invented, and they're going to carry on dying. So we've got lots of stuff bound up in this. So I don't, you know, when people say it's complicated, I actually think it's simple once you leave the extraneous things and find out what it is that you want and speaks for you. And that's, as you've said, is the important thing.
Yeah. Do you think that a will is a good way of putting down in writing your wishes? Perhaps not everyone realizes this. A will, of course, is a legally binding document, but the arrangements that you make for your funeral, for example, if you have a prepaid funeral or something like that, doesn't necessarily mean that that it will also happen that way. What are your thoughts on how to use a will to basically determine what happens at your funeral?
Well, the first thing is I'd never dissuade people from making a will. There's far too many people die without a will or without a proper will, and that causes enormous problems, as we're all aware. Look, the problem with putting how you want to be buried or interred in your will is that sometimes the will isn't formally read until after you are buried. Yeah. And again, we've had this issue, and it happens in certain communities where there is a dispute about how the family believes that the loved one, to use that euphemism, should be buried or cremated. And unless you make it clear, that can cause a lot of problems. And it's not, I say, it's not as unusual as one would like to think. So I think it is a question of, look, many people have power of attorneys or living wills or other documents in terms of end-of-life areas. You can find a lot of templates and examples online. There's quite a good supply of stuff. Just to write down with that what you want and what you would like, and perhaps how you'd like it paid for, if it would be out of your superannuation, or you've got a particular saving, or indeed you might have bought a burial right, you know, beforehand. All this kind of material makes it much easier for people, even if your death is expected. Once it happens, suddenly, bang, that's a really reality check for people. So the more that can be done and arranged before that, the easiest is for people, so they can focus on what is important, and that is the expression and the management of their grief and their sharing and their memorialization, etc.
Yeah, a lot of people, we've received quite a few questions that involve prepaid funerals. it seems such an obvious thing that if you want to control what happens after your death and um, uh, how your funeral is conducted, that you basically organize your own funeral. That's what it boils down to. And funeral directors are only too happy to sell you a prepaid funeral. Um, is it just a positive thing, prepaid funerals? What do you think?
Look, I mean, the problems with a prepaid funeral, from my perspective, are one, how far ahead you do it. So you might do it years and years ahead. And in the intervening period, you might find there's another funeral director that you went to a funeral with and you thought that was just right. I want it like that. But you could be locked into another provider.
Yeah.
That provider might go broke. What are the terms and conditions in terms of the prepaid funeral? Does it cover everything? I'm not saying that's a bad idea, and it's certainly one that people use, but I would want to make sure that there was maximum flexibility and reliability with who I was prepaying it. I mean, there are other options, of course, that you have some sort of savings account where you put the money in either in a block or gradually over time to build up to pay for your own funeral. And then hopefully, and not all of us get this, of course, but when it's apparent that you're going to need that funeral, then you can begin to make the decisions with family. I'd like to think, most people do have some warning, even though it can be hard, maybe, and look, I think of my own mother who could speak absolutely openly about what she wanted and how she wanted it. Other people found that conversation hard. She didn't, but it was her funeral. So I think she was, she and people in her position are allowed to do that.
Yeah. So a prepaid funeral really is sold, is marketed on the basis that it gives you complete control as to what happens at your funeral. But you've pointed out a few things that might complicate even that option.
I'll just say one more thing about funerals, is that actually they're not, while we've said how you wish to be disposed of, that is up to you. But it's not really for you, because sure, you might be looking down with St. Peter on the events, or you might not think you will be. It's really, I think it's important that the family have some input. And if you say, I don't want a eulogy, I don't want music, I don't want anything, actually, a eulogy and music might really be healing for them. Yeah. So again, this is just me, I would not be too prescriptive about my funeral wishes, certainly in terms of what I wanted, but certainly if you don't want them to play Frank Sinatra's My Way, I understand that, but generally do allow the family to put some of their things that are going to help them. Yeah, that's right. It is an interactive thing, if you could say that about a dead person. It's a two-way street. People have to grieve, and the person that has died has to be sure before they die that nothing's going to happen that would embarrass them, so to speak. And Frank Sinatra, I take your point, although he's a very good singer. Can we also talk about people who basically want to do what you outlined there, which is not being too prescriptive, but they do want to make sure that the funds are there to pay for a funeral that is not going to embarrass them or their memory, and is not going to embarrass their family and friends. You mentioned people can save up, but that requires quite a bit of discipline. There are other options. One of the things that is really prolific at the moment is advertising for funeral insurance. Now, I'm asking you the question what you think of funeral insurance, but I already know the answer, of course. But could you tell people, please, what are the bad things about funeral insurance, and are there any good things about funeral insurance? Well, generally, insurance as we know it is to protect you for an event which is unpredictable. Yeah, that happen or not. Yeah, and death is well, we know we're going to die. Yeah. So actually, insurance is it's a bit like, it's a bit of a misnomer in my bag anyway. look, insurance does provide some certainty, but it does come at some cost. The problem is that you might pay premiums over time which far exceed the cost of your funeral.
Yes.
You could pay premiums for 30 years. You could stop paying because you can't, or you forgot it for 1 month in the 31st year, and it's all gone. You have no recourse. You have no claim. You're not covered. Yeah. So I think it's really, you know, look carefully at funeral insurance. If you're really old, it might be the premiums are very high. I know, and that's my dog. He's always also having fun. Yeah. The premiums can be high if you're young. I mean, and look, part of my distaste for funeral insurance is some of the predatory providers who flog it, notably in Aboriginal communities, but also around that. I normally take the cold calls, and I pretended once to be a 21-year-old for funeral insurance just to see how they do it. And they couldn't believe their luck because, of course, you know, they dream of getting a 21-year-old on funeral insurance because they're likely to pay 40 years worth of premiums. Yes. It was very hard to shake them. There are funeral bonds, other ways that you can sort of self-insure, and funeral bonds are regulated by the state government. So make sure that you are actually going to be able to pay them. Yeah, they're guaranteed. Yeah, that is a way which I would, for my, you know, I would find more security. But these things are not as heavily marketed on daytime television as funeral insurance. And the way that they pose it, and, you know, oh, well, make sure those who are left don't have any worries. Yeah, I do look at it a little askance, I have to say. I'd recommend for people generally, Choice have some good work and funerals, about funerals and funeral insurance and choices. Have a look at that. Although I would say that it does generally say that everyone's a crook and be careful. I don't think it's that bad at all. There's some very good providers out there, but it's just a question of finding them. And there are a few very bad ones, and that's the trick to avoid them. Yeah. The thing about funeral insurance, of course, is that, as you said, death is certain. But if you stop paying for one installment, the whole thing evaporates anyway, and you can literally end up paying $40,000 in funeral insurance. We had a case like that. It is generally a very bad idea to take it out, and unless, of course, you take it out today and you die tomorrow. That in that case, they might have a 1 month cooling off period. Okay, so even that is in doubt. I think we have probably buried funeral insurance, if I can make that pun. Just emphasizing that, as you said, just making regular contributions yourself into a savings account or into a term deposit for your funeral expenses is by far the best idea. Although I do add that funeral bonds and also prepaid funerals are assets, but they are exempt assets for the pension means testing. So it is a way of hiding your money from Centrelink, although that should not be the overriding thing, of course. We might move on to an area of particular expertise for you, which is burial land. The regulator for which you are a board member, was set up to basically plan and solve the shortage of burial lands. How's it going? I'll give you a bit of background first of all. I mean, essentially, the concern was originally raised that by 2050, Sydney would run out of burial land. There wouldn't be enough graves for people who wanted to be buried. Now, the word is actually much sooner than that, particularly in certain geographical areas. I'm in the east, you know, eastern suburbs doesn't have much room. There is some new cemetery expansion in the west, but it is not massive and it's slow. So there is still an issue around availability and how much space we're going to have, and particularly with groups such as the Jewish community or the Muslim community or certain other faith groups who need particular sort of places and rituals. They need their own, you know, areas essentially, and those are ones that are particularly under pressure and have been pushing for more substantial planning around this area. So look, we are pretty close to the edge and some work has to be done. The new cemetery that's coming on will give a bit more breathing space. I think we won't run out of space, but this thing has really crept up over time because I don't think the planning authorities really saw cemeteries as essential infrastructure. In fact, you know, planners and architects often look at cemeteries and think they're a waste of land. You know, we could have a park there or we could do something else there. And actually, many old cemeteries are repurposed. And in fact, many around in Leichhardt, Pioneers Park, that's an old cemetery that was turned into a park in the 1930s or something, you know. So cemeteries do change use. It's actually very interesting over time. But while about 67% of people in this state are cremated, the rest, as I've said, due to cultural and faith reasons, insist on burial. And, you know, there's less burial space and potentially further to drive to go to access it. So availability is a key challenge of CCNSW. And we just had a review, an independent external review, which should be made public, I hope, fairly shortly. And that may have some very interesting things to say about land and what needs to be done to ensure there's enough land. Because part of the problem is communities oppose cemeteries. There's been lots of attempts to develop more cemeteries, particularly in the western suburbs and the southwest. People are up in arms about them. Look, I'd love to live next to a cemetery because they're a lot quieter than many of my neighbours. But generally, the mindset is against that. And I think that's part of our role to try and to educate that modern cemeteries are green spaces that you can use. Look, if you believe in ghosties and ghoulies, there's not much we can do about that. But generally, amenity, I would argue, is enhanced by a cemetery, not taken away.
Yeah, and Sydney, of course, features mortuary station, which used to be the station to transport deceased persons to, I think, was it Rookwood?
Rookwood, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that station, which has been restored and refurbished in recent years, might see some new use. We could have a return of that.
Well, look, I think we will see change. I'm not sure we'll see dramatic change because people tend to be fairly conservative about this. There are new technologies about disposing of bodies, which we can talk about, but you know, it's often even natural burial and woodland burial, which is become quite big in Germany and UK that I know of over the past 15 years. You know, still it's only a small percentage of people who actually use it. So the local government or the state government cemetery is still the major place that people tend to go. And I think there will be more options, but the mass market is probably still there. Yes.
One thing I wanted to talk about was because that was also one of the things that the CCNSW was going to look at was renewable tenure of graves. Renewable tenure, of course, means, and it's very common in Europe, means that a grave belongs to a person for 25 years, and after that 25 years, you either need to pay again, or the grave gets, there's probably an official term for that, a respectful term, but basically the grave gets terminated and the remains are removed in a respectful way. Can you tell us how that would work in Australia, how successful or unsuccessful it's been to date, and what is complicating the introduction of a practice that is quite common elsewhere?
It's as you said, it's quite common. It's actually common in other parts of Australia. South Australia, Western Australia have renewable tenure and have had for some time. I think the idea of it is a little foreign for people. And I try and explain it this way, that when you are buried, you get a burial right. You don't own the land. You effectively have a lease on that land. Now that is, at the moment, it's perpetual. So it's for eternity, which is a very nice thought. The idea is that actually if you make the lease for 25 years, then it can be renewed if you want. And it's not like one day after 25 years, if you haven't paid, they dig you up and shove someone else in. You know, there is 5 or 10 years. There's a very, you know, drawn out process to make sure that there's consultation. There are still people alive, and they're not going to be ripped off to extend it. You know, it's a very regulated area. So that's the idea. So you do get a turnover of graves, and after 25 years or 50 years, the remains, as you've said, are respectfully exhumed and then put in a wall or whatever it is, so that their person is still there and they might still be memorialized. It's just the actual space is to be reused.
Yeah. And how's the take up? My understanding is that it is less of 1% of all burial.
Yeah, it's been very small. I mean, one is that the public don't really know or understand about this. 2 is the cemetery operators really haven't offered it and explained it in a way that makes it interesting or attractive. And look, there are people who, you know, it's very easy to scare people about this one, and, you know, say that, you know, Granny's going to be trucked off in the middle of the night and you won't be able to find her. It is a process which has worked historically in many other places. I think we'll be seeing far more of it. But having said that, it has to be, you know, it has to make sense to people that they do it. I mean, the fact is, you know, visitation, as I mentioned, over time does diminish, not for everybody, not for all groups. But, you know, the idea that after 20 years, people are still going every week and putting flowers at the grave does not often happen. So you've got to be realistic about this.
Yeah. And is there potential for renewable graves to actually resolve the shortage of burial land in Sydney, and I guess the urbanized East Coast?
Not by themselves. There still needs to be an expansion of virgin cemetery ground, but it's part of the solution. Yes.
Okay. All right. We might talk a little bit about the pricing of funerals, and we've all read about how expensive funerals are. That is basically whenever a media story appears, it is about the cost, the very high cost of funerals, and the wide divergence between funeral providers. What should a funeral cost is a question that is on everybody's mind.
Yeah, and of course it's how long is a piece of string, because there are many components to a funeral. You don't need all of the components. You actually don't need a big wake or a send-off. You don't need a big memorial stone. Some people choose to have one. So there is there are cut price ways to do it. So there is there's a product here which is called, a cemetery, a very basic cremation where you're taken away and cremated and the ashes are returned. So there's no service, there's no wake. That's what David Bowie had. And, I think there are a number of people who actually like that. It's there's no frill. It's a real no frills service. And in fact, some of these crematoria might be in industrial estates. You wouldn't know where there's crematoria. They're not all big, all ornate things with huge chimneys and chapels. Some of them really are just in industrial areas. So that is one extreme. There is the choice of that. Again, it suits some people.
And during COVID, it has been used far more than it normally is, because funerals could not really be conducted, funeral ceremonies couldn't really be conducted in great numbers, and people just opted for direct cremation, which is what you were talking about, and having a ceremony privately. But the other elements of a funeral, for example, let's talk about a coffin. How much should a coffin cost is a question that I'm asked sometimes. And I tell people that, if you go to Bunnings and get your own materials, you could probably do it for $200. But that is still that is still quite a lot of money. The cheapest funerals, the cheapest coffins that I've seen advertised on funeral providers' websites is $900. But there are also providers that start at $1,400, and they, by law they have to say what that cheapest coffin is. Do you think that's fair?
Well, look, first of all, we're looking at actually changing the health regulations so you don't have to be cremated in a coffin. You do at the moment, and of course that adds to the cost, but the coffin goes up in smoke. Yeah. So, should you be able to, as happens in other states, you can be cremated in a shroud.
Yeah.
To me, that makes a lot more sense. Coffins are interesting because actually, if you can buy direct, I mean, Costco, which is the fairly new American discount warehouse, they had coffins in there. They don't at the moment, but you could get coffins from there. And I think for start very plain one for $400 or $500. There will be a cost. Funerals do come at a cost. They're not free. When we're born through the public hospital system, it's free. But sadly, when we choose to leave this earth, or we don't choose to leave, we're on our own. The state's decided that you should have enough bob, and if you've got nothing, they'll they'll give you a destitute funeral. So yeah. It will come at a cost. And I think we just have to acknowledge that, it's a personal professional service in terms of the funeral directors, in terms of their staff and all the steps they have to do. With the hole in the ground, the cemetery has to mow the lawn and look after it for 100 years. That comes at a cost. So people don't quite understand what the costs are. I think what's important for us as regulators is ensure that there is as much competition as possible and fair competition between the providers, and as much transparency about the prices and offerings. And look, in the past, it's been really difficult because cemeteries literally have thousands of different price items in terms of which rose garden or what, what wall or what this or what that or that. It's just mind-boggling. I think, we CCNSW, IPART, which is the International Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, has just done some work. They've recommended that we set up a comparison website to look at this to help people make choice. So I think that's one of the ways. It'll make sure you can get a more economical funeral, which hopefully would be cheaper for some people, but there's always going to be a certain amount of cost. Even that direct cremation might be $800, $900 or $1,000. So
yeah, the cheapest direct cremation I've seen advertised is about $1,800. And of course, there are expenses. A cremation costs $900, and it's not quite clear to people how these costs accumulate.
It hasn't been, and I might say this is nothing new. Thomas Mort, who was a colonial businessman, and there's various Mort things around Sydney, he actually campaigned against over-ornate funerals and rip-offs by funeral directors, as did Charles Dickens. So a lot of the funeral iconography and ideas comes from Victorian days. People don't quite wear horses with black ostrich feathers and tall top hats, but a lot of it seems to come from there. But tell you what, people have been pushing back against the excesses of the funeral industry for a very long time, and we're still doing it.
It sounds like that. It's a never-ending career. Okay. Perhaps I don't see any questions coming up. Perhaps finally we can talk about what we would like for our funerals. So you briefly talked about that. Can I ask you perhaps a more personal question? You described you would like to be buried in woodland. Why do you want that?
I like the idea, and I've seen this and been involved in it with these sort of woodland funerals. And in fact, there's suggestions for Australian models of this called funeral belts and woodland, which go around the urban fringe. That actually, your family can actually dig the hole for you if they want to. They can fill it in as well with you in it. Now, there's no headstone with natural funerals. There's no coffin with natural funerals. You're buried in a shroud. You know, they might have a GPS location to find you,
yes.
but literally you go back to nature. And actually, to me, that to me is something that we're going back to what most of humanity did. I mean, cremation, and I've been interested to learn about this, a lot of, you know, hunter-gatherer societies practice cremation as well. It depends where they were around the world. So cremation is nothing new either. But I do like the fact that we, you know, it is dust to dust, ashes to ashes, that sort of idea. Unfortunately, those sort of options are not readily available now. There's a few of them, none that really, you know, grab my fancy. But hopefully by the time I do turn up my toes, there will be something available.
You've got a few years, so
yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've covered quite a few topics in the death and funeral, the death and dying and funeral space. I'd like to thank you very much for making yourself available to talk with us. And even though we haven't received any questions, oh, hang on, we've got a question.
Oh, great. I just say, just while you're reading it, 2 places to get more information. NSW, Cemeteries and Crematoria New South Wales, have 4 fact sheets about pre-planning many of the things I've spoken about, even burial at sea, how to do it. You'll find a lot of information there. So if you look for those fact sheets, that will help you find out more about what the options are and also a checklist of what to do. So that will give a bit of benefit. And as I said, Choice had a series of 4 reports about various aspects that can be useful as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now the question is, I'll just read it out to you. I'm signed up to be buried at sea, full body, so not a sparing of the ashes. Do you have any comments or suggestions?
Yeah, look, I was actually looking, this is actually regulated by the federal government and the Department of Agriculture and the Environment. So burial at sea, you've got to be somewhere it's about 3,000 meters deep. So it's off the continental shelf. There's quite a lot of regulation around it, and the logistics of getting a boat out there and buried at sea are not straightforward or inexpensive. But look, people want to do it. And as I said, the questioner, I think that's great. You've got to get the various permits.
Yeah.
It's very heavily regulated. But yeah, again, I think for people who've had the sea in their life, burial at sea would be a great option, and I'm sure more people do it. And in fact, I've spoken to someone who's interested in developing this as a business, where you can actually, you know, get a number of families going out for a mass burial at sea, and that would help keep the costs low.
Yeah, economies of scale. All right. Well, again, thank you for participating. I forgot to mention that at the beginning when I introduced you, that you also have a history with Choice, of course, as a consumer empowerment advocate. Thank you very much for participating, and I thank everybody that turned up today for their attendance. And if you have any more questions, we are quite happy to take them and answer them via email or by phone. For now, though, we are signing off this edition of the CPSA webinar series on planning for later life. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.